Join us this new year for new conversations at the Commonwealth Club.
The Commonwealth Club, I'm George Hammond, Chair of the Humanities Forum, which organized today's event. I'd like to welcome all of you online watching this live stream and all those of you who watch it later. This is one of over 700 programs that the Commonwealth Club has done since the pandemic began, live streaming to you, since we don't have live audiences, at least we haven't until just recently, and our live audiences haven't returned quite in the numbers that we used to have. So we are live streaming everything that we used to do to you so that you can watch in the comfort of your home. We have a very, very interesting program today with Dr. Ann Burgess and Stephen Constantine, who wrote a book about Dr. Burgess's work in the criminal profiling field, how she was involved with the FBI right from the start of that program, and how they developed that, which has now, of course, been a media hit for the last 20 years, different criminal television shows. And I'd like to start. Well, first of all, thank you very much, both of you, for joining us over a live stream. And your quest to decipher criminal minds. Well, first, I'd like to say thank you for your service, because this is a crucial thing in helping protect our society, to try to capture criminals and to do it in a humane way, which you're very interested in. I think it's really an important part of being a civilization. Now, we won't talk about all the other criminal issues, but thank you very much for that service. One of the things that I want to talk about is, well, first let's start with your story of how the FBI tested you. The first thing, you start the book that way. You went into this testing, and I found it fascinating. Why don't you tell us the story of walking into the lion's den?
Yes, well, there were several ways that they tested. The one that I wrote about, of course, in the book was the one where going into John Douglas's office, he has a skull on his desk, and he really watches you to see what your reaction is going to be, what you're going to say, things like that. So, and I found that really interesting, because it is a technique that can be used to see what people's reaction are. So obviously I passed the test.
Yeah.
So, yeah, right. And there were some other interesting things that he would have in his office, and yet it was really curious to see whether you would say anything. Well, why do you have that hanging on your coat rack, or why do you have something else? So that was really, it was funny. It was funny, and I got used to it. I think the other thing I talked about the very first time I was down there, I wake up in the morning to all this gunfire. And I feel they had given me the room right next to where they go out and do their practice shooting at 6 in the morning. I'm thinking, is this another test, or am I supposed to run out? Is this a air raid drill or something? But anyway, it was all in good fun. And but I saw that they did it to others, so I didn't feel that I was being singled out.
Well, it's fascinating because for me, and of course there's differences, but 3 chapters later, you talk about the one thing that struck you from all of the criminals, all of the serial killers that you talked to, that the one thing that they all did in common was that they stared at you with great attention to see if you would squirm when they told you certain details. And there's a similarity there, and of testing you to see how you react. And I'm curious. I know that there are differences, and you should maybe distinguish those two things. But it is interesting that as if the male mind always wants to see the female mind squirm a little bit.
Well, yes, that was, and of course it was on these photographs that they had of the crime scenes, which were very, very, very real and very frightening. I mean, they were very disturbing. It's no other way of putting it. And actually, there were some people that couldn't look at the crime scenes, and they were not invited back. So that was a test that you had to really pass to be able to be part of their team that was going to be looking at profiling. And that made sense. You certainly could not do profiling if you couldn't look at the pictures and the photos. So But that was not a problem for me,
Mhm.
if you will, because being a nurse, you're exposed to all kinds of situations, especially in the emergency room. People
Right.
come in bleeding and so forth. Of course, hopefully they're living,
Mhm.
but still, it is, and you have to work on them. So you have to
Mhm.
do hands-on for those
Yeah.
patients. So I think that really held me in good stead for handling the photographs. At least they didn't jump out at me or anything.
Yeah, your nursing background is interesting because you were in nursing and then you went and got a PhD in psychology, right? And then
No, I got a PhD in nursing.
oh,
Nursing has its own science, and that was my area was psychiatric nursing. So I was
ah,
interested in understanding more about the behavior of people. So
mhm,
that I think is what also was very helpful for my background
mhm.
in working with the agents.
Did they have any other nurses involved on the FBI profiling team? I mean, was that something they looked for?
Not necessarily, but the first nurse that I met on the case of the little missing Ackerman
Mhm.
girl was a nurse who then went into the FBI. So
Mhm.
she had done it that way. Then I had the person that really put me in touch with the behavioral science unit was Rita Connect, and she was uh, a registered nurse first and then became a police officer, but she kept up her skills. That's
Mhm.
why she knew about the article that we had written. But
Your
it's a good,
approach
for
to, yeah,
your
go ahead.
question, it's a good background to have. The FBI is always interested in the backgrounds that people have, that
Mhm.
they like to have different backgrounds. And I think at the time, Ken Lanning always talks about, he had a economics background and never thought that would be of any necessary use, but it sure helped him to get into the FBI.
Yeah. So your approach reminded me a little bit because you're in nursing in the medical field. It reminded me a little bit of what medicine does. That is that they're trying to standardize the approach towards something. There are people, doctors, who feel that they are really good at what they're doing, might feel that some of the standardization gets in their way. But for the vast majority of people, it kind of ups the overall benefit to everybody. And you talk about profiling in pretty much the same way, and maybe I thought you'd talk about that.
It was, and actually, John Douglas, if you ever talk with him,
Mhm.
he was very fascinated in a project I was working on, which was on cardiac rehabilitation. We were looking at how fast we could get somebody who had had a heart attack back to work. And so he listened to this and he says, "This is what we want in profiling. It's the
Mhm.
characteristics and how do you evaluate them and so forth." So I also felt that was an important background piece that I had
Mhm.
that he was able to really relate to and ask me a lot of questions about it. So that was the medical background was very helpful.
Stephen, you were pulled in to work on this book, and did you have any background in this kind of crime writing, or did you know Anne? How did you get pulled into this project? Because it's fascinatingly
Yeah.
different, I'm sure. Yeah.
Yeah, so I didn't have experience with this type of crime writing. I do have an MFA in writing and literature, which was certainly helpful. Dr. Burgess and I had been working on a larger project here at Boston College, an event around the Mindhunter series when that came out on Netflix,
Mhm.
where we brought John Douglas up, who had written that book, and had Dr. Burgess on stage on campus to discuss what it was really like, what Mindhunter got right, what it was like behind the scenes of the FBI, to pull back that curtain a little bit. And the more I spoke to Dr. Burgess and the more I learned her story, and how she helped take all this messy data of victims and victimology and serial killers and was able to parse it and put it into a comprehensive form that the agents could then use to capture serial killers. It was super interesting, something that hadn't been told before, neither her story nor the evolution of profiling. So we started chatting about what might be a good way to present that. And the book was the idea that came out of that.
Yeah, well, it certainly met its goal because it does a great job of doing exactly that. You mentioned the television shows about this. Have you found, or has the FBI found, that they have a great increase in applications for the profilers since, like people fly around in private jets everywhere they go on the shows? I assume, by the way, that the FBI does not fly its criminal profiling team once a week to a new location, in a private jet with nice white leather seats and everything. So why don't you disabuse people of that notion?
The only plane I flew in at the FBI, and I don't know if they had any, was a little four-seater that took me from Chicago Airfield into the little Seminole Airfield in Illinois. So I have no experience in any of those wonderful jets. I don't know whether they have them. Sorry.
Another
It
thing
is interesting.
Yeah.
Dr. Burgess teaches one of the most popular courses here at the Boston College campus, which is about forensics. And many of her students do come up and take an interest in wanting to get into profiling. So I think her work certainly opened the door to a whole different demographics of people that might be interested in that field that perhaps weren't before.
Yeah, that's great. It's really great. Maybe one other thing. Those shows give the impression that there's so many serial killers that every week you can go to a new place and find another serial killer. The number of serial killers is not that high, I assume, from the statistics that I've looked at. So how many a year does the FBI have to deal with? 5 or 6 or 7 or is it more than that?
Oh, they have more than that. They have profilers, coordinators, what they call them now, in every major FBI office in every state. So you're looking at a lot of potential. And when they get a potential serial killer, they really have to jump on it. So I think that they're catching them faster. That's what we hope is happening, so that if they get, and they've even, it used to be 3 or more would make a serial killer, so to speak. And then they dropped it to 2 or more. They felt that they could understand the patterning better, or with only 2, which might be making the difference. But I will say, just for your audience's sake, there's a lot of unsolved cases. The statistics are they only catch about 64% in each state. Well, that adds up over and over and over. So that's why they have so many unsolved cases, or cold cases, as they call them. Now, whether they are serial killers, we don't know, obviously.
Right. There was a case here in California not too long ago that they finally got somebody after many, many years, and he was already in his 70s or something like that. Just was arrested last year. So another part of the profiling is there's a distinction between the criminal profiling that you do and then what people complain about, which is racial profiling, stopping people on the streets by the police and everything. Why don't you draw that distinction out so that the audience knows what you're aiming at with the profiling, and that this is a completely different thing. So this is not a racial issue, et cetera.
No, and you're absolutely correct. And in the early beginning, that was a very harsh criticism of the program. And we were a little astonished by it, because in no way was the racial issue anything that we had thought was going to be an issue, if you will. And we tried to clarify that this is all based on behavior. That's where it changed from the more psychological piece. We let the psychological piece go to the other people that specialized in that. But the agents were very concerned that they teach their local law enforcement as well as their agents about behavior that had a very specific pattern to it. And that's where we focused on. So the profile would be gender. Gender was important, work, living conditions, work conditions, all of those kinds of things, because that's what the suspects and the local police could go back and look at their suspects. So it had nothing to do with the racial issue. But you're right, it came up and was we had to do a lot of work on that to educate people that that's not in any way what we were intending. And in fact, it just so happened that there were the serial killers at the time that the project was going on, which would be getting men, it was always men, we didn't have any females, between 1960, 70, and 80, and they were all white. So they never, and the agents had to be invited in to do a profile. So even though there may have been other races involved, if they didn't get invited in, we couldn't do the case.
Yeah. It's this is a different kind of profiling than just stopping people on the street and frisking them and all that kind of stuff. So
Oh, right.
right. So the value of it, we'll talk a little bit more about some of the cases, but there's one case that was from the 50s before you started to standardize this and everything, the George Moretsky case, the Mad Bomber, where an early version of this detective profiling was able to say that when you arrested him, he'd be wearing a double-breasted suit that was buttoned. Okay, so now this is what people have, from television, that you can make these kind of predictions and they come true, and then you've got the right guy. So in this case, it actually happened that way. But why don't you draw the distinction now as you did in the book? Because I think that's a crucial thing. Yeah.
Right. That was the Mad Bomber, the George Metesky case, and that was the profile that was given at that time, and exactly as you read it. That was now. Why did he say that it would be buttoned? Well, he was assuming that he's projecting that this was somebody who was very obsessive and very detailed and very concerned about how he looked and so forth. So it wouldn't be someone that was just didn't have a tie and all that on. So saying that it was buttoned, I think, was a very logical behavioral kind of statement to make, and it turned out it was. I think in the case, what happened is they did go to his home late at night, and he was in pajamas, and they said he could go up and change, and he did, and of course came down, and that's where he had the button vest and so forth.
Nice.
So they hit it on target. And some of the profilers will try to do that. It's a little tricky because if you're wrong, of course, they'll make a big deal out of it, but it is something that they have tried. And I think Stephen had a case, found one of the cases.
Yeah, there definitely have been cases where these really interesting profile characteristics will get pointed out, and people are really fascinated, and they'll say, wow, how could you have thought of that? There was one with Douglas pointing out that the killer would likely have a lisp. But it's interesting because even though that's really compelling to hear, it's not very useful in the profiling process itself. The profiling process works best when you have all sorts of minute data points, behavioral elements that come together to show you a fully realized image of who this serial killer is likely to be. And then you use that fully realized creation to narrow down onto the smallest possible suspect pool. So that's what really helps, is that sort of comprehensive profiling as opposed to the one-off sensational details.
Yeah. And I imagine that part of the process, since you're trying to standardize this, is to not make the net so small that people can work outside the net and you actually lose the criminal. I mean, you miss the criminal because your net is too small. It's drawn too small. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that's why they do make more general kinds of statements, and then the local police take what they send to them, and then they look over their list and say, aha, maybe we should go back and interview this person or that person. So yes, that's the intent.
We have a very interesting case like that, but I think what we should do before we get to some of the cases is you have a couple slides, and then there's some interviews. There's 2 interviews, and is this the group that you of guys that you joined at the beginning? Is that the kind of
this is the group, right? They've got right there. They've got their unit chief, Depew, Roger Depew. They've got Bob Ressler next to him. They've got John Douglas. They got Ken Lanning. I think they have most of them. They really started with 8, and I worked primarily with about 4 of them that were really intent on the study that we did. Don't forget, this was set up as a research study.
Right.
So that's where I got to have more contact with them.
Yeah, you started doing research with them, and then you got pulled into cases later, right?
Correct.
Yeah. All right, and the next slide is from, do you know which criminal Mr. Monster is? Which one of them that this was? Just to give you an idea about how they wrote to the police.
Yeah, Stephen, that's
Berkowitz right there. Yeah.
Yeah.
But that was interesting too, because Berkowitz signed it Mr. Monster, and a lot of serial killers that Dr. Burgess did research on, and the team at the BSU did research on, would relate to that element, and they would also describe having a monster inside of them, having these sort of split realities that they lived in, where there was a monster that came out and committed these evil acts. But in their own mind, the rest of their personality was very normal. They were just an average person. So that was definitely a theme right there.
We'll get back to that a little bit later too. The idea that the celebritization of the serial killers has changed their behavior. And when you wrote about that, I thought of Bonnie and Clyde and the bank robbers. And it used to be bank robbers that were during the Depression, when nobody had any money. It's like everybody would like to have been a bank robber, because then they would have money. I don't know why everybody would like to be a serial killer now, but there is something about it that's shown on TV, and it's, I guess, the freedom to do whatever you want to. That attracts people. I do think it's interesting. I'm old enough that when Jeffrey Dahmer was the person that everybody talked about, it was interesting to me that Jeffrey Dahmer was pretty much a joke. People made fun of it, whereas they were afraid of somebody with a passion murder of their spouse or their lover, but they weren't afraid of being Jeffrey Dahmer because nobody wanted to be him, what he did. Almost nobody wanted to be him, or almost nobody was afraid that they would do what he did, But more people are afraid that they might kill their spouse, or so on. So I found it interesting, and I don't know if you ran across that too, that there's some people are just so far off the grid in their behavior that people turn them into a joke and aren't as afraid of them.
Well, that is true that some people are really far off on their behavior. That's absolutely true. And you do wonder whether there should have concern there. And I think that's what we get into with some of the prevention work, is what red flags should we look for on people that are getting too far afield in their behavior, and could they be thinking some of the dark things that the serial killers that we certainly studied got into, because that's exactly what we were trying to look at. So you're right, that's always a concern.
Yeah, well, you didn't make it any more popular, I'm sure. Don't worry about it. Your work was helping make it a little bit harder for them to get away with it. So it had to make it worse for them. And the next picture, I think, is shows what you were like as a young nurse before you got involved in this, right?
That's right. That's back when I was just a registered nurse, doing regular nursing, not doing the psychiatric nursing.
Yeah. It doesn't look like you would end up getting involved with tracking down serial killers at all.
No.
And the next one, the next slide is a little bit later. So after you got involved?
No, this is after I got involved.
Yeah.
Yes, this would have been back well into the 90s, right, where I was. That's when I got into academia. I was interviewing for positions at both Boston College, which is where I had my first academic position, and then University of Pennsylvania, where I had my second major academic job.
Well, we have two clips of serial killers talking about what they did, and they're both interesting to show how they think about themselves. And this is all part of your study. How do they think about themselves, and then how does their behavior reveal that, so that you can try to explain what it would be. So why don't we play those two clips? They're both only about a minute long or something like that, so our audience can see these people as people. Go ahead.
I'm trying to remember this from a long time ago, but another round had entered and exited that padding area, so there were 3 holes in that padding area that was head level with her. It was off to her right, to my left. She was moving about in the back quadrant there, trying to avoid the shots. That wouldn't have happened. I realize if I'd never done it, it wouldn't have happened, but my original intention was to make it very quick and neither one of them to be aware of what was happening, and it was not to keep them from stopping the crime. It was to keep them from suffering. I had a real bad problem depriving people of their lives. It wasn't the aspect of killing them, that was the aspect of possessing their bodies afterwards. So it was almost after an effect, evicting someone from their human body. And I'm sorry it sounds so cold, but that's about what it analogizes to.
At what point do you feel that you lost the control that, that led ultimately to the deaths of these women?
What would be different in each case?
Yeah, each one is varied, huh?
Yeah. Some for an example, with Shona Hawk, Shona and I sat down for probably an hour, just talked, laughed, and I got ready to leave, got up, and as we customarily did, we gave each other a hug and a kiss. But this particular time when we embraced, that's when that switch was flipped, that monster came out, and it was over. Whereas the attack on Valencia Jumper, as soon as I came in the house, bam, it was on her.
Now, these two men, the first one, Kemper, would dismember the bodies afterwards, right? That's what he was known for. And the second one, surprised, they weren't looking for somebody. He knew his co-workers, he knew friends and family. He killed people that he knew well. Unusual case. So we'll go back to his case. I want to end sort of with his case because it's got so many interesting elements in it. But I'd like to back up to a case from the Bay Area, actually, the cheerleader case or whatever they call it, where a 15-year-old girl killed another one. And it was a single incident. It wasn't a serial killer. But your profiling said something about the potential killer, which allowed them to catch her. And why don't you tell that story? Because it was set right in Orinda, here in the Bay Area. And of course, it's still a well-known story. It's 35 years later or whatever, 25 years later.
Right. That was very important because when the FBI got called in, it went cold for about 6 months. They had potential suspects, but they just weren't coming up with anyone solid. And they had polygraphed all of the ones that they were concerned about because they had lots of information. They had witnesses that had seen the person who had shot the young girl. They saw her car. So those are two very good things. And they certainly felt that she had to have lived in the area. So it became what happened is they sent the case to Quantico, to the Behavioral Science Unit to be profiled. They did the profile. And when they sent it back, that's when it said, well, we interviewed someone just like you're saying, but she passed the polygraph. And so then it became an issue of the agent said they better find out what questions were asked, why she might have passed it, et cetera, et cetera. So they did that, realized that the right questions weren't asked, that they really should bring her back in and polygraph her again with one of the FBI polygraphers, which they did. And that turned into not only was that, it was over a 3-hour interview, and the young suspect had really developed a relationship with the polygrapher. And that at one point she turns to him and says, "You think I did it, didn't you?" And he said, "Yes." And with that, she goes home, and that's when she leaves the note for her mother that she had done this. So it was a very different kind of use of the profile to inspect and see whether they had used some strategies that hadn't worked. So that was very useful. The other thing is it was a female on female. We hadn't done cases like that. It was very important for us to see whether the profiling method would work. Again, with not only female offender and potential suspect, but the that they were teenagers. They were young. And most of the cases they were profiling were men, usually in their early 20s, et cetera.
I would add that one of the reasons that case in particular, even though it was just a one-off case, was so important for the profiling process and its evolution. And one of the reasons we wanted to include it in the book was because up until that point, as Dr. Burgess said earlier, serial killers that the FBI went after were all white, were all males, 20s and 30s. And in fact, all the profilers at that point were white men as well. And Dr. Burgess, being the only woman on the team, always had a sense of, who's missing from this table, whose perspective aren't we getting? Because if the idea of profiling is to be able to think your way into a serial killer's head, you need different dynamics, different backgrounds to be able to do so. And this case showed that profiling could work on somebody outside of that original case study. And it ended up sort of justifying profile to a degree in the eyes of the FBI. And the team ended up getting more resources and more agents after that to go after a wider demographic of killers.
Yeah, and so it went from serial killers focusing to even just one-off murders. How far afield has profiling gone now? I mean, is it useful in petty theft? I mean, it might not be worth the time and effort, but can you, if someone is a thief with a certain way of doing things and so on, can you profile them and help them catch, or is it not been applied like that yet?
No, it has been. In fact, they were doing it at the time. I'd be sitting in John Douglas's office or Bob Ressler, and a call would come in. They did an enormous amount of telephone intervention, if you will. It would be on threats. People, owners of stores or owners of banks, they said, there's a threat on the bathroom wall. Someone's going to be killed. And what do we do? How do we figure it out? And that's where they would profile. So it was used very much with other kinds of cases, not just the serial killing. So that's where the behavioral part was so important. And sure enough, I think we even put one case in the book where that is how they had profiled the case. It was a bank type case, and there had been I think, Stephen, you probably remember that one better than I do, but that was a good case where the bank was the victim, if you will, not necessarily any one person. And was the bank going to be blown up?
Yeah, it's by being so useful, you got a lot more money. I mean, the FBI did, and then the FBI department grew. When you grew above the specialists that were working on this, were there more mistakes? Were there times when you profiled something and you never found anybody, and you wondered whether the profile was too small? Or it's easy to talk about. I mean, there's so many successes. But I think when you apply something as a standard, you have to kind of understand what the downside is too. So,
absolutely, they made it very clear from the beginning that they were not going to be hitting on all cases. Absolutely, they would do their best. They made that clear when they sent the 2 or 3 page profile that it was just another resource for the local law enforcement to look at. And I think we do put in the book one where it was. It was not profiled in a way that was helpful initially. So we wanted to include that. Now, the other point that you make, I think is important, is who trains them. I always said anyone that was trained by Ressler or Douglas was very, very, very good, because they had been trained by the best. And Douglas and Ressler were very demanding in terms of how they would get it. So we had, I think by the time I finished the project, it was up to the 3rd generation. So we had the 1st generation that I worked with exclusively, and then the 2nd, and then the 3rd. They were all trained by either Bob Ressler or John Douglas. But once Douglas retired, then it went to I don't know how it went from there, because obviously I wasn't there. So you always have to look at who has trained the person. I think that's always, in any discipline, very, very important.
Any discipline. So you did this starting in the 70s, right? And then 80s. So your research in the 70s,
Really
in the early 80s as profiling.
Right, early 80s.
So DNA hadn't really gotten started yet. So DNA evidence became not a competitor, but another line of activity. Did you ever combine the two in a way that was useful?
Well, some of the cases we had some kind of forensics on, not necessarily as specified as today, but they had the groupings. You still had blood groupings, and they had some things that they could point to. But where I think forensics has made such an impact is excluding people. Sometimes they would have someone they thought absolutely was it, and they run the forensics, and it wasn't. So they would he was exonerated, and that was important. And I think even today, people use that as a very helpful measure. But with forensics now, it makes it a lot easier, if you will, if you have that both parties. You have the victims and you have a suspect. That makes it a lot easier to profile, I guess you could say. You don't have to profile if you've got the forensics necessarily.
Right.
But there was a bit of a gap period too, where DNA wasn't sort of collected in a repository in any sort of, centralized system. And there was one particular case, which we ended up cutting out of the book, where it talked about profiling a killer who had a pretty long career and profiling all the details very accurately at the BSU. Not able to catch the individual, but then when forensic became more mainstream, the forensics proved that this was the correct individual, and the profile and the forensics came together to make a really compelling case against this person.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, well, the BTK killing was one. Don't forget that went on for years. We were down there. He was there was, and then there were 10 victims, I think, and then there was another couple of years, and then they were able to get the DNA because it had gone on so long. So as Stephen said, some of the cases were caught that way. They just had to wait.
I wanted to talk about the BTK killer because one of the issues that came up was he was inactive for a while, then he became active again, and part of the profiling was to provoke him. And I was wondering if after he was provoked again by the FBI to try to bring him out, and I tell the story about how he with the floppy disk, and he gave himself away, and basically he was caught this way. But did you ever provoke somebody who by reacting to him and making him, that he then went out and committed more crimes because he was provoked?
Yeah, well, we did that in one of the chapters on the use of media. That was
right.
where it was so helpful to try to draw him out. And I know that Douglas did a lot of work on that and how to help the local police get to their media and to use the newspaper in those days as a way to get him to communicate more. And that's exactly what happened with BTK. And obviously others, Berkowitz, some of the others were, a lot of them would try to communicate, and it's the ego that gets them. They want, they want that. And one of the best things it can be to do an anniversary reaction. If you have a cold case, anniversary kind of summary, and that was the way that they actually got the raider to come forward. He wanted to criticize some of the way that he was portrayed.
You didn't get me right. Yeah, right. You were too harsh. I'm not that. But right. It's interesting that you can provoke them with a clever strategy. It's certainly used on the television shows all the time too. That same approach. It works perfectly in 10 minutes on the television shows. But in this case, he gave away his information by sending a floppy disk in with some information. And he didn't realize that you could do there's background information on the floppy disk which gives away the location and stuff like that. So that was brilliant. But the other famous serial killers who were caught by wanting the attention. You mentioned Berkowitz. That wasn't something you worked on, but a similar case, right? Right.
Yes, that's true. I'm trying to think of some of the others that we had. We had 36 serial killers in the study, and there were 2 that they had to give themselves up, that the police never were able to catch him. Kemper, of course, was one.
Right.
And he had to call in and say, go to my address and you'll find my mother and her friend. So sometimes they are that good, if you will, with getting away with it, that you don't get them.
Yeah, you mentioned in the book there were two unusual cases that gave you that they were more self-aware than most of the serial killers, and
Right.
and that was Kemper, the man the tall man with the mustache that we heard speak earlier, and a guy named Matty Rossi or something like that.
Monty Rissell, yep.
Monty Rissell.
Right. Yeah. Why don't you talk about the distinctions because they were both interesting cases where they thought about it a lot more of what they were up to and still confused themselves, but still they were more self-aware, as you said.
Right. And it's important to look at them as in that manner. We've talked a little bit about Kemper. He was someone that had to quickly kill his victim. The clip that you showed, he was talking about shooting his victim he's at the driver's seat and the victims are in the back seat and he shoots them, and he talks about shooting through the head seat and so forth, and then possessing the body. So that was what was important to him, and the whole dismemberment. Now, Monty Rissell was very different. He was one that would rape first and then he would kill. And he didn't start that right away. He had a long period of escalation. He had about 12 rapes, well documented in the records we were able to find, up until the time when he was only 19. I mean, he started out as a teenager. Yeah. And his first murder was he had captured her, he had raped her, and she tried to get away from him, and he got very angry. And so and he hadn't thought of it before. It's just that at that moment he killed her. The second one he thought a little bit more about it, but it was when he got to the third victim where he said that is where it really had set in. So his determination to kill was not developed, if you will, for a time period. Now, he also let one of his victims go, so that he did have some compassion. She was pleading with him that she was caring for her father that had cancer, and his brother at the time was going through a series of cancers, and he let her go. Yeah. So that didn't happen, I don't think, in many of the other cases that we had. Yeah. So he was very different. Certainly personality-wise, certainly in his commission of the crime, and from Ed Kemper, both pretty articulate. And I think if you had watched the Mindhunter show, he said something that all of them seemed to say. It's like when the agents say, we're here to try to understand why you did what you did. He turns to them and he says, well, I hope you do, because I'd like to know myself. Right. And many of them just don't understand why they kill. They're obsessed with it. They're compulsed to do it, but they don't understand where its origin comes from.
That's also one of the sort of early misconceptions that the BSU and Dr. Burgess had to face when they first started going after serial killers. You know, the FBI said, why would you waste your time? These are just crazy people. These are just monsters. There's nothing more to it than that. But I think through the research that Dr. Burgess did, she found that these killers were very complex individuals. They could be empathetic. They could be charming. They understood reality very well, but they just also had this element of fantasy that they rehearsed over and over in their heads, to the point that that fantasy became more important than reality itself. It became something that was almost sacred. So they had to constantly go towards that fantasy until they tried to make it something that was perfectly realized in the real world.
Do you think that video games that are like this help them do their fantasies almost realistically, or do you think that because in one of your cases you say that the imagery that set the person off came from detective magazines like Detective Comic Books, so there's nothing new about the video games versus the detective comic books. It's the imagery. And there are people who talk about, like, say, Japanese society that has a sort of comic book violent underclass, not underclass, but right, part of the society, and yet they have very little crime in their society itself. So after being in this field for a while, what are your thoughts about that?
Well, yes, I think that the visual imagery, it's the detective magazines, what that was used for was more of a projective technique to find out what it was in the suspect's, in the person we were interviewing's mind that was arousing to him, because we knew that would be the key. And he does say, one of the videos that you've shown, he did say that there were times when he would just touch the victim, he knew her and so forth, but he just was compelled to kill her. That it just took that, and that had to have come from somewhere. And so using the detective magazines to try to narrow down more specifically was very, very helpful.
Well, let's talk a little bit about Henry Louis Wallace, the second video clip. He said some very, very fascinating things that you recorded in the book. One of them was that he wasn't really inside of himself, that he was hovered above himself, and that it took 2 hours sometimes afterwards to come back down. So he hovered above himself while he was doing this. I'm sure you're aware that NDEs, near-death experiences, people describe almost exactly the same experience. So, and of course, there's also this whole tradition of yogis in India and Buddhist monks in other places trying to get to that state of mind, which this guy was in when he committed his killings, which is a fascinating, difference. And he was the one who killed his friends. Another odd thing, and his coworkers.
Yes. And what you're describing, there's a technical term, it's almost like a dissociative state,
right,
where they go out of themselves, if you will. And that's exactly what he described. And I think you said it perfectly. It's that super state, or that altered state, I call it an altered state, where they're looking down at obviously at the victim and acting and not totally aware themselves of what's going on. So that is something that others have said, other suspects have said, or other killers have said. And we really need to understand that. And I think that the question is, well, how do they get into that state? What is it that gets them there? Is it just being in the situation with the victim? Or sometimes it can be because of drugs that can change a person's state of mind. We know that. And I think in that case, that was part of it. So all of those things became so important for us to really, or could it be that there was more of a state that had been the chronic state in the person's mind? So we were always mindful of trying to understand as best we could the kind of baseline of the mental state of the person, and then compare it to the state that they were able to describe when they actually did the killing. And then the state afterwards. We always looked at the before, during, and after part of a crime.
You mentioned in the book, I'm going to come back to that in a second, but you mentioned in the book that for a lot of the killers, it's not the killing that's important, it's the rituals afterwards, as if it's setting up for a ritual.
It's setting up for a ritual. It can be before too, and it can be after. Yeah.
I don't want to bring in every other culture, from ancient times, but there was a lot of ritual killing that took place for the last couple thousand years. I mean, it's been minor for the last couple hundred years, from society. But there were lots of ritual killings. That was a big part of how people dealt with their relationship with the universe, or however they want to put it. And those, if Carl Jung is right at all, some of those imageries must be still in us, and some people may be afflicted by them. Who knows? But the big question for me about this is, you identify this, and as you said, it's not just this one serial killer, but other ones with this dissociative state, and then there are thousands or even millions of people in trying to pursue this as a spiritual goal, to get into a dissociative state, so that their universe goes along and they just accept the universe and witness it. There's plenty of descriptions, not only in Carlos Castaneda with the drugs, but in Buddhism and Hinduism, as the state that you're trying to aim for to prove that you are a spiritual being. I find that fascinating that they're the same experience, and maybe we'll figure that out in the next couple hundred years. But there it is. We've got two strands. One who thinks it's the greatest good on earth, and the other, it's pretty obvious it's not good for them.
I think one of the points that Dr. Burgess, made pretty clear to me too, was that it is this ritualistic element. If you're thinking about this one fantasy, this one concept over and over and over again, that does become sacred to you, and that is a vehicle that will elevate you to what you think is a higher state. So for these killers, they got stuck in this way of thinking, this very patterned way of thinking, and that's what sort of led them down the path that they ended up on. And then they were constantly chasing that high again once they experienced it the first time. Either they weren't able to live out that fantasy as perfectly as they'd originally imagined it, or the high wore off, and so they had to go and kill again. So there are those elements too that are pretty similar to what you're talking about in sort of elevating consciousness capacity. Yeah,
I think this is a fascinating part of the book, because it certainly makes it human, because it's an attempt at something. And this is the negative part of it. I mean, people who study it realize there's a whole spectrum for almost everything that we do. There's wonderful romantic sexual behavior, and there's absolutely awful, cruel sexual behavior. It's almost like all of our actions are neutral, and what we bring to it psychologically gives it almost all of its meaning. But there we are. And I'd like to remind our audience that if you have any questions for either Ann or Stephen, that you can send them in through the chat room. But there are a couple in already, and not too unpredictably, one of the first ones is, which is your favorite criminal detective on TV? Who do you think does this the best as far as the TV goes? Or can you not stand watching the shows?
Yeah, I don't have time. I don't know if I have a favorite. I don't have a favorite. Stephen,
you seem to get along better with the real life versions of them.
Right. I've dealt with more of the real life versions. Right. Yeah.
Well, here's another question. I don't know if you're familiar with the neurologist's work, but there's some work in neurology that's trying to locate lesions in the brain that are responsible for criminal behavior, and then be able to predict in advance this. Have you looked into it at all, and do you think that this is part of what you're doing, or do you think it's a totally different thing and don't think it's effective?
Oh, no, I think that there has been a lot of research. They have speculated on that. It certainly should be done. I know that anytime you have a serial killer and you go to trial, they have to have a full neurological workup, because they're looking for any possible explanation. Do they have a tumor? Do they have, some other kind of thing? So I think that's all very much in the realm of research, and it's important. And there could be, but they've never really definitively said that there was one. That also gets you into the nature versus nurture aspect. Is this something is there genetic loading on any of this, or is it more that the person is the way they're brought up? And we really take the latter, that it is more in the developmental phase that something goes wrong, something is fixated on. It becomes almost I think as Stephen was just saying, that they just develop this small kernel of a violent act, and it just goes over and over, and then they act it out, and if it doesn't make it like they think it will, then they got to repeat it. So that's part of the terrible part of it, is they keep trying to improve their fantasy, and it ends up with more victims.
Yeah, you mentioned the genes. So the DNA researchers think, well, maybe there's one particular gene that causes you to be a criminal, and neurologists think it might be something in the brain, and behaviorists think it's something else. So all these things interact with each other, but there's no one's at all close to a simple answer for this, and that's why your standardization works so well for bringing it down to a little bit easier to find the people that are doing it. The next question that's being asked is, again, something we did talk a little bit about, but if the perpetrator is outside the norm or intentionally does that knowing about your standards, would that make it easier for them to hide? Do you think that a criminal, could look at the standardization of this criminal profiling and figure out, say, say they're a woman or a minority or something like that, and they're not supposed to be in this mix, and then they can somehow do their crimes in a way that makes it harder for them to be found. Do you find many criminals that are that far thinking in advance?
Well, we find many criminals that are very interested in what we've been writing. I know that all of us have received requests for our articles to maybe do exactly what you're saying. And are they learning? Will they be able to be a better killer, if you will, get away with it more? I mean, that actually is something we are going to be looking at, is to talk to people that have gotten away with their crimes and find out how they were so successful, because that hasn't actually been asked in that particular way. So maybe we'll have some answers for you, but I'm always interested in how, look at Kemper. He was so very good at getting away with his crimes. And yet he left plenty of red flags around that could have been picked up, but weren't.
But the killers were, and this is something that came out in Dr. Burgess' research, one of the themes of the killers was they were very interested in the investigations. They paid a lot of attention to them. They liked to try and insert themselves by offering to be helpful in these investigations. So that cat and mouse game was sort of central to the crimes as well. That was a big part of the act. And a lot of them actually had wanted to be law enforcement officers or be in some position of authority too. So they kind of got off on that. That was a big deal to them, to match wits with the officers.
Yeah, interesting. The inserting into the people talk about that. Somebody goes missing, and then they often find somebody that's out there looking for them is the responsible party. I mean, you had a couple of cases like that, I'm sure.
Oh,
right?
yes. That more than a few. That was often, you would predict that they were going to do that if it was a type of killing that they had really planned and so forth. Yes.
They could also probably make people look in the other direction. It's like, look over there.
Yeah.
One of the really interesting things you talk about in the book is, trying to answer the question, why do killers kill? And one of your answers is they try to make the world right again. They try to something's out of order, and they're trying to put it back in order, and they feel a violent act will put it back in order. That's another big cultural issue, because we have a lot of history saying this has gone wrong. Someone's got to take a punishment for it, a scapegoat. Someone must be punished violently in order to put us back with the gods in the right thing, or with one God in particular. So this is, even if people aren't religious, it's part of culture to think that somehow, just like the idea of spanking children, that will make things right, or that if someone has done something terrible, we should torture them in order to get the right answers out of them. It's not built into us, I think, inherently, but it's been a big part of our cultures, and so it makes it a little easier to understand them, the serial murderers, when they say, "I did this to make the world right again." You want to talk about that? Because it's just a weird, it makes it sound so weird, what we do.
Right. It makes it sound a little counterintuitive, but also you wonder if that has happened to them. And so they're then repeating that to try to rebalance things, as you say, that could be going on. Because we do know that there's been a lot of, in their histories, they can have some pretty bad experiences.
Yeah.
So that can be part of the answer there. But their thinking, you can see where their thinking is certainly flawed at certain levels.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that was interesting. There were a lot of cases, the Joubert case comes to mind, where something traumatic happened to this killer early in their life. And oftentimes the victims then would match their age when they experienced that traumatic event. And so it's almost like they're trying to go back and set things right by forcing other people through that same experience to make things equal as a way of resetting, to sort of take back that moment by doing it to someone else. And it goes back to this fundamental element that is, true to all of them is this idea of control, to taking back control, to having control. And they would do that with their victims. They would try and do that in the interviews with the profilers by trying to test them to see if they truly knew the story of the crime. So, I think, and it's like you said, in cultures at large, sacrificing someone so that there will be rain is an element of control. And that was really consistent.
in your quiet moments, did you ever think we have to change this part of our entire culture about sacrificing something to put things right in order to put an end to this kind of attitude that people have? I mean, I don't think that it would take such a long time for any kind of shift like that at all. But it's
Well, we certainly have to do something because murder rates are going up.
Yeah.
I'm not sure they're serial murders, different, there are different types. Obviously, we know there are different motives to murder, but the violence in our society is certainly, people have to be concerned about it.
Do you feel
And,
that this is another side effect, but we bring the pandemic into almost everything nowadays, but do you think that people being locked down, not living their normal lives and everything, that the frustrations of all that is contributing to the rise in the violence and the murder rate and everything?
I haven't seen any evidence of that, but it certainly is something to look at. I think that those types of murders are, I'm not sure that I'm seeing that as a motive. So I'd have to see more on the statistics of why we're seeing like what 25% in some cities.
Yeah.
Yeah, good
The first
question.
big increase in decades, right?
Yes.
So we have a question from someone in the audience, Marcia Maitri. She said, does the BSU ever work with forensic genealogists? You know, this idea, you did have a case like that in your book, so.
Yeah, very interesting. A question. Yeah, that's a new area. I
Yeah.
mean, that's one to get into. It's really very, very interesting. They did try that on, it wasn't really exactly that, the BTK case, where they used the daughter's DNA. But that's a great area. They've had a couple of real successes in that area. So I'm going to be watching it.
Yeah. Why don't you explain for the audience that doesn't know what that is, but it's like tracking down the DNA through genealogical things, and it's scaring people who've all had their
Right.
genes done by these things that all the information might get one of their cousins end up in
Right.
jail, right?
Right. Well, they've warned people about that. I know when all this genealogy came out, or you could send your DNA in and they would do all this to it. So they did warn people, and they have found out that the DNA, well, first of all, mitochondrial DNA is where it's transferred by the mother. So that we've realized, but then this is using other family members, going to the family tree and seeing if any brothers or cousins or aunts or uncles or whatever could be a possible match for the DNA. And it's, as I said, they've hit on some cases. The Golden Gate Killer, I think I think he was caught that way.
Yeah, I think that was the one George alluded to earlier, was that case
Okay.
out of California, the Golden State Killer. And he'd been inactive for decades, but had been incredibly prolific while he was active. And yeah, it was a family member of his that had done a DNA, and they pinpointed him through that.
And there was a case I read about where it went back and forth because they had, they were getting close. They knew that there was something there. And it turned out that somebody related that they had had a child out of wedlock that they didn't even know about, and that child was a perfect match, and that was the one who committed the crime.
Aha,
And you
very
think,
good.
not only do you find out that you have a child you don't know about, but he's a criminal, right?
Right, and he's the criminal. Oh dear.
That wouldn't be a good phone call to get.
No, that would
Yeah.
not be a good phone call to get. And we hope nobody in the audience gets that phone call. But if you do, it helps solve a crime, and therefore, you should cooperate.
Good. Yeah, right. Very good.
Anything that you'd like to tell the audience? One last story or one last thing before we say that was a great conversation about this. Anything you'd like to tell? Any one person that stands out where you felt that person, if not for just like a little bit of a move over in one direction, that person could have lived a normal life instead of a serial killer life? Were there any ones that just really affected you that way?
Yeah, so I think that is very important, that if there had been somebody in the family situation that had been able to support, be a good mentor to I think would have made a big difference. Many of these serial killers had the absent father. We found that out, had the absent father, so they didn't have a male authority figure that would be able to kind of keep them on track. So I think that there were a lot of situations that might have turned out very differently if there had been someone in the family. And that's why we try to say to the child of the developmental aspect and the social networks are really important resources for kids to grow up so that we don't have, we aren't growing any serial killers, so to speak, and we try to keep the victimization. The other thing is, of course, to try to do all we can to understand how this happens so that we can prevent more victims. Our whole theory was to try to show how we could prevent more victims, and then you would have obviously fewer serial killers.
Right.
I'd add too that one of the important things to Dr. Burgess when we first started on this project was keeping in mind the victim. A lot of stories about serial killers, pop culture, TV shows sensationalizes them to a degree. And Dr. Burgess made it very clear that she wanted this book to speak for the victims. And I'll let you say a little more about that, Dr. Burgess.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, the victim is often very forgotten. I mean, how many, the serial killers, how many can you tell me their victims' names? No, it's lucky if they can remember any. And yet there have been many, many victims. So we've always tried to impress upon that. And the family is very important, the victim's family, but not to forget the killer's family. They too suffer in their own way of having raised or lived with a serial killer. So the families are something that we need to put more attention to, whether it be the victim's family or the offender's family.
Yeah, and I mean, you focus on that in your book too at the end, and I think that's just wonderful. But you also mentioned that the profiling that you did, you don't only profile the scene, you profile the victims, and that helps solve the crime too. I found that fascinating. In what way does knowing more about the victims give you that access? Yeah.
Well, that was the primary reason that they brought me down to the BSU, because I had worked with victims. And if you realize, investigators don't work with victims, they're looking for the criminal.
Right.
So they didn't have a lot of experience in that. So that all the questions that I would get when they were profiling would be around the victim. And what could we learn? Why was she targeted? Why was she killed? What was her life like? What can we learn from all of this so that we could then try to find out who might have, what clues there were to be able to find out more. So victimology was the very first, first they would go, they do organized, disorganized to get themselves settled on that. And then they go in the victim.
Well, we can't turn back the clock and disallow divorce anymore. And we can't, I'm sure, although there could be a more conservative time in the future that does that, to say, fathers have to stay home, make that the rule again, because so many criminals have that absent father problem, et cetera. So that's not the solution. Understanding what makes it happen. If that understanding were made available to potential problems, like especially if you took like this one guy who started raping people when he was a teenager, if you had kids that were picked up in the early stages of their violent career, and given some explanation for why they're feeling this way instead of just punishing them, you might be able to not just keep them in jail the whole time. But we have a very difficult problem on our hands, and really useful. First, the book is really useful, and second, the work that you did was fantastic for helping us move forward in how to deal with this without just, catching whoever we want to, chop their heads off, and move on. Right? We have to do it in a more civilized way. So, thank you again, and it was great talking with both of you. And so ends another event at the Commonwealth Club in its 119th year of enlightened discussion. Thank you very much for joining us. We hope we'll see you again.